Hey guys, tonight we're going on a journey one that stretches over centuries and continents. Picture yourself stepping into the bustling marketplace of Chang'an, where the air smells faintly of exotic spices and silk, the kind of silk you can almost feel brushing against your skin. In the distance, camel caravans trudge through the dusty streets, and the clinking of gold and silver coins fills the atmosphere. You can hear the soft whispers of traders speaking languages from every corner of the known world. It's a sight and soundscape you might imagine in a dream, but it's reality, and you're right at the heart of it now. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, feel free to share where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always love knowing where our little journey is reaching now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story we're diving into tonight begins in a time long before GPS and shipping containers. Imagine this, it's around 2,000 years ago, and the world looks vastly different. The idea of connecting east to west seems almost impossible. Yet, the ancient civilizations of China and the Mediterranean had one major thing in common. They both had valuable goods to trade, and trade was the lifeblood of their prosperity. This trade, at its heart, wasn't just about commodities, it was about connections, relationships, and the flow of ideas across the continents. The birth of the Silk Road, an iconic name now, but back then, just a series of rugged paths winding through deserts and mountains, wasn't a grand design, but more of a series of fortunate accidents, the result of exploration, conquest, and a fierce desire for resources. You can thank the ambitious Han Dynasty of China for getting the ball rolling. In 130 BCE, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty sent an envoy named Zheng Qian on a journey that would change the world. Zheng wasn't just an adventurer. He was a diplomat, a spy, and, in some ways, the first ambassador of China to the West. Zheng's mission was to seek alliances with the USA people, but as often happens in history, he ended up discovering something much bigger, the vast interconnected world outside China's borders. He returned with reports of cultures, cities, and goods far beyond the empire's reach, including the vast riches of the Parthians who controlled the Iranian plateau. His journey inadvertently connected China with the West, and in turn, the West with China. This paved the way for a complex network of trade routes that would link civilizations from China all the way to the Roman Empire. Historians still argue whether Zheng Qian's diplomatic mission was more about opening a strategic alliance or discovering the immense wealth that could be traded along this new route. Either way, his journey ignited a passion for exploration and exchange that would last centuries. In a way, he laid the first stone for a bridge across continents. The Silk Road was born, and while it started with one man's journey, it soon became a highway for traders, diplomats, missionaries, and even invaders. Imagine the contrast between these two ancient worlds, the sophisticated, cultured society of Han China, with its expansive bureaucracy and advanced technologies, and the vibrant, bustling streets of Rome, with its grand architecture, roads, and marketplaces brimming with goods. The Silk Road, though it wouldn't take shape for another century, set the stage for this remarkable cross-cultural dialogue. At first, goods traveled in small quantities, exchanged primarily between regions that were already aware of one another. But as time passed, the trade routes expanded, and more merchants ventured into foreign lands, each carrying not just goods, but also new technologies, philosophies, and ideas. Silk, as you might guess, was at the forefront of these exchanges. But don't be fooled. Silk wasn't just a luxury fabric. It was the golden thread that connected civilizations, driving much of the early trade, diplomacy, and even warfare along the route. But there was another reason why the Silk Road was So influential it wasn't just about commerce. As goods moved west, so did stories, religions, and cultural practices. One of the most profound exchanges along these ancient roads was the spread of Buddhism from India to China. Traders, monks, and missionaries carried the teachings of the Buddha across the mountains, deserts, and steppes, bringing not just the fabric of religion but its philosophy to new lands. The journey was slow, often perilous, but the trade of ideas had a far-reaching impact. Historians still debate whether this was truly a religious highway, or whether the spread of Buddhism was merely incidental to the economic exchange. After all, religions often expand alongside trade, but the Silk Road was unique because it allowed for a more direct human connection, a pilgrimage for both the mind and the body, that, as Zhang Can and his successors learned, the Silk Road was much more than a trade route. It was a lifeline for cultural exchange, stretching from the majestic mountains of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the bustling streets of Baghdad to the magnificent palaces of China. It was, in essence, the first global network, predating our modern world by centuries. The birth of the Silk Road wasn't just the result of military conquests or imperial ambitions. It was also about curiosity that drove explorers, traders, and even merchants to venture into the unknown. For them, it wasn't just about wealth or power, it was about discovery. They sought knowledge, spices, textiles, and above all, connection. As you lay back now, imagine what it must have been like to travel those ancient roads. The sights and smells, the clinking of coins and silk, the faces of people from far-flung lands, all sharing a common desire to connect. The Silk Road was more than just a trade route. It was the world's first true global highway. Now that we've set the scene, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of the Silk Road's reach. Picture this: you're standing on the edge of the Han Dynasty in 130 BCE, watching a caravan prepare for its journey. Behind you, the sprawling fields of China, where silkworms are busy at work weaving their fine threads. Ahead of you, the unknown. The caravan will follow paths that have existed for centuries, but were now being woven together in new ways, thanks to Zhang Can's journey. But how exactly did the mighty Han Dynasty contribute to this monumental exchange? Well, we can think. The Han, for more than just starting the Silk Road, they also made sure that it flourished. Emperor Wu, known for his bold military and diplomatic moves, was the driving force behind the expansion of the Han Empire. His reign saw China reach its greatest territorial extent, stretching deep into Central Asia, by sending Zhang Qian to make alliances with the nomadic tribes to the west. Emperor Wu opened the doors to trade routes that would stretch all the way to Europe. Historians still debate whether Emperor Wu's motivations were primarily for military expansion or economic prosperity. But one thing is certain: his reign set the stage for a monumental cultural and commercial exchange. The Silk Road wasn't just about luxury goods, though silk became its most famous export. The route carried everything from gold, ivory, and precious stones to exotic spices, medicines, and even horses, valuable commodities that shaped entire empires. But let's not get too caught up in the heavyweights of trade. Let's talk about something a little more quirky. Ever heard of the Silk Road's most exotic export? Well, it wasn't gold or spices, it was horses. Yes, horses. Particularly the famous Fergana horses from the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. These horses were so highly prized that the Chinese went to great lengths to acquire them. They were faster and stronger than the Chinese horses, and they became essential for warfare and agriculture. They were so valuable, in fact, that the Han government sent emissaries to negotiate for these horses. And at one point, a full-scale military campaign was launched just to get them. Imagine that. The first Silk Road military operation was about horses. Historians still argue over the exact military significance of these horses, whether they gave China an edge over its rivals, but one thing is clear. They were a key player in the Silk Road trade dock, so while silk may have been the shining star of the Silk Road, the true backbone of the trade was a more humble yet vital beast. But horses weren't the only living commodities making their way along the route. The Silk Road was also a highway for seeds, plants, and even diseases. Yes, much like how modern global trade spreads everything from products to pathogens, the ancient Silk Road did the same. Historians still argue whether the spread of diseases like the plague along the Silk Road was incidental or inevitable, but the fact remains that the route played a significant role in spreading the deadly black death to Europe in the 14th century. But let's not get too dark, shall we? After all, we're here to explore the wonders and not the tragedies, as we meander along the Silk Road. It's important to take note of the social and political changes that began to take root as trade flourished. The Han Empire didn't just trade in goods, it traded in influence. The Silk Road allowed China to influence regions far beyond its borders, from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. This wasn't just about trading products, it was about establishing diplomatic ties, cultural exchanges, and creating a web of alliances that stretched across vast territories. The Silk Road became, in essence, a conduit for soft power, with China using its vast economic wealth to sway surrounding regions. One of the most interesting things about the Han Empire's role in the Silk Road is how it simultaneously cultivated isolation and openness. On one hand, the empire was fiercely protective of its borders and wary of foreign influences. On the other hand, it was deeply committed to trade and cultural exchange. This tension between openness and caution can be seen in the way China controlled its interaction with foreign powers. Imagine, if you will, the bustling markets of Chang'an, where merchants from India, Persia, and even Rome gathered to trade wares. They would have likely been met by Chinese officials who, while welcoming, would also keep a watchful eye on these foreign merchants. The process of securing a trade agreement involved diplomacy, negotiation, and often a bit of military might to ensure that China's interests were protected. Yet, in exchange for this protection, China reaped the rewards of a robust trade network that brought goods from the farthest reaches of the ancient world. But the Silk Road wasn't just about one-sided trade, it was a two-way street. Goods flowed in both directions, with China receiving a variety of exotic goods from the West. The Romans, for example, eagerly traded wine, glassware, and even tin with the Chinese in exchange for silk. And what did the Romans do with this precious fabric? Well, they turned it into an exclusive luxury item, a symbol of wealth and power. The Roman elite would wear silk as a sign of their status, and some historians even suggest that the demand for silk was so high that it contributed to the eventual fall of the Roman Empire's economy. There's a theory, of course, that the obsession with silk played a role in draining Roman resources, but historians still argue about the connection. For now, let's think about the trade routes themselves. Picture the map. At one end, you've got China with its imperial cities and vast deserts. At the other, you've got the Roman Empire with its well-paved roads and Mediterranean influence. And between them, a complex network of paths that zigzag through mountains, deserts, and steppe lands. It wasn't a perfect road network like we imagine today, but it worked, often with dangerous detours, extreme temperatures, and unpredictable conditions. Remember the caravans? These long lines of camels trudging through the desert, each one laden with precious cargo, were the lifeblood of the Silk Road. Without them, the Silk Road would have never been able to sustain the massive flow of trade goods. The famous Silk Road caravanserais, or roadside inns, were built to give traders and their camels a place to rest. Some of these inns were nothing more than a few tents by the side of the road, while others were grand structures, complete with gardens and pools, offering a moment of peace before the long journey continued. As we picture these caravans making their way across the desert, we might imagine the distant stars overhead, guiding the travelers toward their next destination, every step taken, every mile crossed, bringing them closer to their next encounter. As we continue down the winding Silk Road, it's time to focus on a commodity that was so valuable. It became synonymous with the root itself, silk. Imagine the softest fabric you've ever touched, but now add centuries of tradition and craftsmanship. This fabric didn't just keep people warm or adorn the wealthy. It was a symbol of power, prestige, and connection across the ancient world. China was the undisputed master of silk production, and they kept the process a closely guarded secret. For centuries, the method of silk production was a mystery to the outside world, and that secret was tightly woven into China's cultural and economic fabric. The Chinese worked their silkworms with great care, producing some of the finest silk cloth the world had ever seen. Historians still argue about when and how the secret of silk production made its way to the West. Did the Chinese share it willingly, or did it leak out through espionage or trade? Regardless, it wasn't until the Roman Empire began to receive shipments of silk that the world truly understood the value of this luxurious material. But let's backtrack a bit. In the early days of the Silk Road, silk wasn't just a trade good, it was currency. It was the means by which empires, kingdoms, and nomadic tribes measured wealth. In the West, Roman aristocrats coveted silk so much that they paid astronomical sums for even a few yards of it. Some ancient sources claim that silk was so prized that it was sometimes more expensive than gold. This gave rise to an entire industry of traders and merchants who would buy and sell silk as though it were a precious metal. As demand for silk spread, the trade route extended beyond China, all the way to the Roman Empire, and eventually even to the farthest reaches of Europe. As you journey through time with me, picture yourself as one of these Roman elites, proudly draped in the finest silk, walking through the grand marketplaces of Rome, showing off your luxurious garb to anyone who might glance your way. You've just made a powerful statement, not just about your wealth, but about the global connection you're part of. In a sense, this was the Silk Road's greatest gift, a world where people from different cultures, with different languages, ideologies, and practices, were connected by a shared love of beautiful, valuable goods. Historians still debate whether the obsession with silk in ancient Rome helped foster a sense of imperial arrogance, or whether it simply highlighted the sophistication of Roman culture. Some argue that silk became a metaphor for the Roman Empire's insatiable appetite for luxury. After all, if you had silk, you were powerful. And it's not just about the fabric itself. It's the way silk represented access to a world beyond your own borders, a world that promised new wealth, new ideas, and new experiences. The love affair with silk wasn't just about a textile. It was about the allure of the East and the belief that owning silk was akin to owning a piece of the mysterious, distant lands of the Far East. But back to China for a moment. While the Romans might have been obsessed with silk, it was the Chinese who truly understood the deep cultural significance of the material. To the Chinese, silk wasn't just a luxury, it was a spiritual and cultural symbol. The Chinese used silk for everything from ceremonial garments for the emperor to burial clothes for their deceased. Silk was seen as a link between heaven and earth, a material worthy of the gods. It was so sacred that only the highest-ranking officials were allowed to wear the finest silks, while the common people were relegated to simpler, more modest cloth, while the Chinese kept their secrets close to the chest. They were more than happy to share their silk with the rest of the world. But the world didn't just take. Along the Silk Road, there was a mutual exchange of ideas, culture, and technologies. From the West came glassware, pottery, and the occasional rare spice, while the East shared not only silk but also advances in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Traders, scholars, and even emperors exchanged knowledge as easily as they exchanged goods. The Silk Road wasn't just a network of trade, it was a network of ideas. Imagine, if you will, a caravan of merchants crossing the harsh deserts of Central Asia. They are laden not only with silk and spices, but with scrolls of knowledge, which they trade along the way. Each caravan crossing the vast steppes represents a small exchange of cultures and ideas, from the Davis teachings of China to the Roman gods of Olympus. Over the centuries, these exchanges would change the course of history, shaping everything from the arts and sciences to the very way people viewed the world around them. Historians still argue over the extent to which the Silk Road facilitated the spread of ideas and knowledge, but it's clear that it had a profound impact on the ancient world. In fact, some scholars even argue that the Silk Road was the first true global network for knowledge sharing, long before the internet or even the telegraph existed. From the translation of Buddhist texts to the spread of the art of papermaking, the Silk Road was a crucible of intellectual and cultural exchange. But the story of the Silk Road isn't just about the grandeur of silk or the exchange of ideas. There were moments of tension, too. For every smooth trade, there were occasional confrontations. Along the way, the road was dotted with powerful empires that sought to control the routes, sometimes leading to wars and skirmishes. The great nomadic tribes of Central Asia, like the Scythians, the Huns, and later the Mongols, saw the Silk Road as a path to power. These tribes weren't interested in silk, they were more focused on dominating the trade routes themselves. But even in conflict, trade didn't stop. In fact, empires and nomads alike were often forced to negotiate, creating a system of alliances, exchanges, and compromises that kept the Silk Road moving forward. Imagine the Mongol Empire's impact. On the Silk Road, in the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his successors united much of Central Asia, providing unprecedented stability across vast regions of the Silk Road. For the first time in centuries, merchants could travel across the routes without fear of bandits or rival empires. The Mongols did something truly revolutionary. They created what could be seen as the first Silk Road peace, encouraging trade and cultural exchange in ways that hadn't been possible before. Historians still debate whether the Mongols' dominance over the Silk Road was ultimately good or bad for trade. While their empire brought stability, it also imposed a strict order on the regions they controlled. But one thing is certain: the Mongols played a crucial role in keeping the Silk Road open and active, even when other empires had struggled. As we continue our journey along the Silk Road, it's time to move beyond silk and spices to the more obscure treasures that the route facilitated, like, for example, glass. Yes, glass. It wasn't a commodity that might immediately come to mind when you think of ancient trade, but it played a surprisingly large role in the exchanges between East and West. Picture this: intricate glass beads, vessels, and even mirrors, making their way from the Roman Empire to the heart of China. These delicate items, prized for their beauty and craftsmanship, would travel thousands of miles across deserts and mountains, their fragile forms somehow surviving the long journey. Origins of glassmaking in the ancient world are still up for debate. Historians argue over whether glass was first invented in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but it's generally accepted that it was the Phoenicians, with their advanced trading networks, who helped spread the art of glassmaking throughout the Mediterranean. From there, it slowly made its way eastward along the Silk Road. Roman glassmakers, known for their skill, produced items that were sought after by the wealthy elite in China, Persia, and India. The Chinese, in turn, were fascinated by these shimmering items, which contrasted sharply with their own ceramic traditions. Imagine being a Chinese noble, receiving a beautifully crafted glass vase from a Roman trader. The glass's transparency and sheen would be unlike anything you'd seen before, and yet it would become a symbol of status and sophistication, something to be displayed in your palace or temple. Glass wasn't just about luxury, it was also a practical item, used for everything from storage vessels to intricate jewelry. Over time, glass made its way into everyday life, making the long journey from the Mediterranean to China and vice versa, despite the risks and challenges of the Silk Road. Glass is just one example of the unexpected commodities that crossed the ancient trade routes. But let's shift focus to something that had a more direct impact on everyday life medicine. In fact, one of the most important aspects of the Silk Road was the exchange of medical knowledge. While traders and merchants might have been the ones physically moving goods, scholars, physicians, and healers were the ones exchanging knowledge. Historians still argue over the extent to which medical knowledge spread along the Silk Road. Was it a slow process, or was it one of the first true instances of global knowledge transfer? One thing is certain: the exchange of medicinal herbs, practices, and philosophies helped shape the way different cultures approached healing. For example, the Chinese were experts in herbal medicine, and they began sharing their knowledge with the people of Central Asia and the Mediterranean. At the same time, the Persians, with their extensive knowledge of surgery and anatomy, passed on their wisdom to others. By the time these practices reached Europe, they had been combined, modified, and refined into the medical practices we would later associate with the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Along with herbs and healing practices, one of the most significant contributions from the East was acupuncture, a technique that originated in China around 2,000 years ago. Acupuncture wasn't just an alternative form of treatment, it was a deeply philosophical practice rooted in the belief that life force, or qi, flows through pathways in the body. This ancient knowledge slowly made its way westward, passed along by traders, monks, and scholars, and would eventually influence the development of alternative medicine in Europe and beyond. But let's not forget about the more unusual medical practices that made their way along the Silk Road. The Persian medical tradition, for instance, included some rather quirky remedies that involved the use of animal parts. One particularly strange treatment involved using crocodile dung as a poultice for wounds. Imagine that for a second, the stench of crocodile dung being applied to your skin as a cure for an ailment. While we may laugh at the thought today, it was a common practice in ancient medicine. Thankfully, we've moved on from those days. Historians still argue whether these eccentric remedies actually worked, or if they were just part of the mysticism surrounding ancient healing traditions. Not now. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of what the Silk Road facilitated. It wasn't just the exchange of goods and ideas, it was the coming together of entire civilizations. Alongside the exchange of material items, the Silk Road also witnessed the fusion of cultures, the sharing of beliefs, and the development of new technologies. This was a time when empires were growing, societies were changing, and the world was becoming smaller, piece by piece. One of the most fascinating aspects of this exchange was the way different civilizations borrowed from one another. For example, the Chinese took much from the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, learning from their innovative methods of horsemanship and warfare. At the same time, the nomads learned from the Chinese in areas such as agriculture, architecture, and technology. Over time, the borders between these different cultures blurred, creating a fascinating blend of traditions, languages, and technologies dot, and let's not forget the role of Central Asia in all of this. It's often easy to overlook the nomadic tribes that called this region home, but they were the lifeblood of the Silk Road. These tribes were not only skilled traders, but also fierce warriors, and their control of vast stretches of land made them indispensable in connecting the East and West. Without their expertise in navigating the harsh desert terrain and their ability to maintain the trade routes, the Silk Road would not have been as successful as it was. Historians still debate the exact relationship between the nomadic tribes and the settled empires along the Silk Road. Was it a symbiotic relationship based on mutual respect, or was it one of tension and conflict? It's likely a bit of both. As empires like China, Persia, and Rome grew stronger, they sought to control the trade routes that passed through Central Asia, but the nomads were not easily subdued. In fact, many of them eventually became powerful players in the Silk Road game themselves, especially with the rise of the Mongols in the 13th century dot. As we move through time and space, the Silk Road continues to evolve. The goods, ideas, and technologies that traveled along these routes had a lasting impact on the world, shaping cultures and civilizations for centuries to come. From the development of new medicines to the spread of philosophies and religions, the Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was a conduit for the exchange of humanity's greatest ideas. Now, let's take a moment to explore one of the most vibrant and culturally rich stretches of the Silk Road, Persia. Nestled in the crossroads of the ancient world, Persia, modern-day Iran, was uniquely positioned to act as a bridge between the East and West. The Persian Empire, one of the world's oldest, held strategic control over many of the most important trade routes of the time. It was not just a place for goods to pass through. It was a cultural and intellectual crossroads where ideas from China, India, and Rome mingled and blossomed out as we travel through Persia. Picture the grand cities of Ctesiphon and Persepolis immense, awe-inspiring capitals that once ruled the region. These cities were not only centers of political and military power, they were bustling hubs of commerce. Silk, spices, and even rare gems passed through these cities like a river, feeding the empire's vast wealth. The Persian merchants were known for their sophisticated trade networks, which included connections stretching all the way to China, the Indian subcontinent, and the Mediterranean. Now, imagine you're standing in the center of one of these markets, surrounded by exotic goods from all over the ancient world. The air smells of cinnamon, frankincense, and myrrh spices that were highly prized not just for their flavor, but also for their use in religious ceremonies. The streets are lined with traders who have come from every corner of the known world. There's a buzz of conversation, laughter, and bargaining as goods change hands. Some items are more valuable than gold, while others are exotic curiosities never before seen by the locals. Here, you see silk and glass from the West, and in exchange, the Persians offer their own treasures, like fine carpets, intricate metalwork, and their own exotic fruits, which would eventually make their way to the Western world. But Persia wasn't just a conduit for material goods. It was also an intellectual and cultural hub. Persian scholars were responsible for preserving and translating many works of Greek, Indian, and Chinese philosophy. They played a crucial role in making sure that the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and even Buddha were passed along the Silk Road, ensuring that intellectual traditions from diverse cultures would be shared and preserved for future generations. If you were an intellectual traveler on the Silk Road, Persia was the place to stop, not just to trade goods, but also to engage in lively philosophical debates and exchange ideas. As we continue along the Silk Road, it's time to talk about the role of one of the most essential commodities that traveled these routes: spices. While silk and precious metals might be what we associate most with the trade route, spices were just as, if not more, important. Spices had a reputation not just for adding flavor to food, but also for their medicinal properties. For centuries, spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were coveted for their ability to preserve food, mask the taste of rancid meat, and heal ailments. They were also highly prized as luxury items, so much so that they could be used as currency. In some parts of the world, imagine the life of a merchant who specializes in spices. He might travel from the spice islands of Southeast Asia, through India, across Persia, and finally into the markets of Rome. Every stop along the way would be an opportunity to pick up new goods and trade valuable spices, but it wasn't just about the physical journey. The spice trade was also wrapped in intrigue and mystery. Spices were often shrouded in secrecy, with merchants going to great lengths to protect the locations of their spice sources, making sure that the rest of the world remained in the dark about their origins. Imagine the excitement and satisfaction that came with successfully completing a journey to obtain the most sought-after spices of the time. Historians still argue whether the desire for spices was the primary motivator behind the exploration and expansion of the Silk Road, but it's clear that without these prized goods, the routes wouldn't have been as lucrative. Spices helped fuel empires, fund exploration, and even influence global history. The rise of empires in India and Southeast Asia and the eventual search for new spice routes to the west set the stage for the great age of exploration in Europe. If there was ever a driving force behind the Silk Road, spices were surely among the most influential. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Silk Road is how it intertwined with the spread of religions. As we've touched on before, Buddhism was one of the most significant religious movements that traveled along the route, but it wasn't the only one. The Silk Road also played a key role in the spread of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Islam, and even Manichaeism, an ancient religion that was an amalgamation of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. These religions didn't just travel as abstract ideas, they became part of the daily lives of the people living along the Silk Road. Imagine walking through a city like Samarkand, where the sounds of Buddhist chants mix with the call to prayer from Islamic mosques, and the distant hum of Zoroastrian fire temples rises in the background. This was the reality for the people who lived along the Silk Road. Different faiths coexisted, influencing each other and creating a melting pot of religious thought. Many travelers, missionaries, and scholars came to the region to share their beliefs, which then spread throughout Central Asia, Persia, and even into China. The blending of religious ideas along the Silk Road is one of the most fascinating aspects of this ancient network. Every city along the route became a point where multiple cultures and religions converged, creating a space where new ideas could be exchanged and, in many cases, transformed. Historians still debate the extent to which religious tolerance and exchange along the Silk Road fostered peaceful coexistence or caused tension. Certainly, not every religious exchange was peaceful, but in many places, the Silk Road provided the conditions for greater understanding and acceptance of diverse religious practices. This exchange of both ideas and practices laid the groundwork for later global religious movements, making the Silk Road one of the most significant cultural and spiritual highways in history. As you imagine the bustling, diverse cities along the Silk Road, think about the people who walk these paths. Not just the famous emperors or conquerors, but the everyday merchants, travelers, and pilgrims who shaped the story of the route. They were the ones who ensured that goods, ideas, and beliefs moved from one corner of the world to another, creating a network of trade and culture that would last for centuries. Now that we've covered the bustling marketplaces, the precious goods, and the exchange of ideas, let's take a moment to dive into one of the most vital elements of the Silk Roads: success. the humble yet essential role of the camel. These animals, often thought of as the unsung heroes of ancient trade, were the true backbone of the Silk Road. They were the ones that carried the goods across the most hostile and rugged terrain, from the scorching deserts of Central Asia to the towering mountains of the Hindu Kush. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of camels, their feet soft against the desert sands, their long necks swaying with the rhythm of the caravan. They carry enormous loads of silk, spices, glassware, and precious stones, all packed into specially designed saddlebags that ensure the goods remain safe through the long journey. These animals, known for their resilience and endurance, were the perfect companions for the treacherous conditions of the Silk Road. Their ability to go for long stretches without water, their capacity to carry heavy loads, and their docile nature made them the ideal choice for transporting goods over such vast distances. Historians still argue over how and when camels became the primary mode of transport on the Silk Road. Some believe that camels were first used in the Arabian Peninsula, while others suggest that they were domesticated in Central Asia. Regardless of where they came from, the impact of camels on the success of the Silk Road cannot be overstated. Without these incredible animals, the trade routes would not have been as efficient nor as extensive. The camels made it possible for goods to move faster and more securely, helping to ensure that the Silk Road remained a viable and profitable route for centuries. But let's pause for a moment and reflect on the life of a camel caravan. Picture yourself as a traveler, following one of these long caravans across the vast open desert. You're traveling through a landscape that feels almost otherworldly, endless dunes stretching in every direction, with nothing but the faint outline of distant mountains on the horizon. The heat is oppressive, the sun relentless, and the air is thick with dust. Yet, amidst this desolate landscape, the caravan continues its steady pace, with camels plodding forward as if they've been walking for centuries. The creak of their saddlebags, the soft sound of their hooves in the sand, and the occasional murmur of the traders offer a quiet rhythm to this otherwise silent journey. The caravan's journey is long, often taking weeks or months to complete. Along the way, the traders stop at caravanserais, roadside inns built specifically to cater to these long-distance travelers. These inns provided a much-needed rest for both the camels and the humans. Here, traders would rest, eat, and prepare for the next leg of their journey. Some caravanserais were simple structures, while others were elaborate with gardens and even pools. Imagine arriving at one of these oasis-like stops after a long day of travel. The heat of the desert still lingering on your skin as you dismount and stretch your tired legs. The smell of food wafts from the kitchens, and the sound of laughter and conversation fills the air as traders share stories from their travels. But the life of a camel caravan was not without its dangers. The routes were often plagued by bandits who would lie in wait for a caravan to pass, ready to pounce and steal the precious goods they carried. The harsh desert landscape itself posed its own threats. Sandstorms could arise with little warning, and the lack of water could be a fatal obstacle. Some traders didn't make it to their destinations, lost to the harsh conditions of the road. But for those who did survive the journey, the rewards were substantial, both in terms of the material wealth they gained and the cultural experiences they collected along the way. Historians still argue whether the risks of traveling along the Silk Road were ever fully understood by the traders. Did they embark on these journeys with a sense of inevitability, knowing that the road ahead would be fraught with dangers? Or did they see the Silk Road as just another trade route, one that, despite its challenges, offered the potential for great reward? It's hard to say for certain, but it's likely that each traveler had their own perspective. For some, the risk was simply a necessary part of doing business. For others, it may have been an adventure, a way to discover new lands, meet new people, and witness the wonders of the world as we travel alongside the camels and their human companions. It's important to remember that the Silk Road wasn't just about goods. It was about the movement of people, the merchants, the travelers, the pilgrims, the soldiers, and the nomads who each had their own story to tell. Many of these people had no idea how their travels would affect the course of history. They weren't just moving products from one place to another. They were laying the foundation for a new world order, one where cultures, ideas, and technologies would converge and blend in ways that no one could have imagined. The nomadic tribes of Central Asia played a crucial role in this exchange. These tribes were the ones who, for centuries, controlled the vast stretches of the Silk Road, providing both protection and guidance for the caravans that passed through their lands. They were the true masters of the desert and the steppes, and their knowledge of the land made them invaluable to the success of the trade routes. Without their expertise in navigating the harsh terrain, it's unlikely that the Silk Road would have been as successful as it was. Imagine, if you will, the nomadic tribesmen guiding the caravans through the unforgiving landscape, pointing out hidden sources of water and sheltering the travelers from the worst of the storms. They were the unsung heroes of the Silk Road, without whom the trade routes would have been far less secure. Yet, despite their crucial role, these nomads were often overlooked in the grand narrative of the Silk Road. Today, however, we can appreciate the vital role they played in keeping the trade routes alive. Historians still debate the long-term impact of the nomads' role in the Silk Road. Were they simply pawns in the grand schemes of the empires, or did they actively shape the course of history? While some see them as passive participants, others believe that the nomads were the true architects of the Silk Road's success. They were the ones who knew the land better than anyone else, and their influence stretched far beyond the trade of goods. They were the ones who connected the East and West in ways that no emperor or ruler ever could dot. As we continue along the Silk Road, we find ourselves in one of the most dynamic and fascinating periods of the trade routes history, the time of the Tang Dynasty in China. The Tang Dynasty, which reigned from 618 to 907 CE, is often considered one of the golden ages of Chinese history. Under the Tang, China was not only politically stable and militarily powerful, but it also became a cultural and economic powerhouse. Largely due to its role in the Silk Road, the Tang Dynasty saw the flourishing of art, literature, and innovation. The empire's capital, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, attracting merchants, scholars, and travelers from all over the known world. The city was a melting pot of cultures, with people from Central Asia, Persia, India, and beyond arriving to trade goods, share ideas, and forge diplomatic alliances. Chang'an became the central hub of the Silk Road, connecting East and West in ways that hadn't been seen before. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty. The air is thick with the smell of exotic spices, perfumes, and the distinctive fragrance of incense. Merchants from Persia, India, and even the distant Roman Empire are hawking their goods. Everything from fine silks and textiles to rare jewels and spices. In the grand marketplace, you can hear the sounds of various languages being spoken, from the melodic Persian to the harsh tones of Central Asian nomads, and the familiar sing-song of the Chinese merchants. Everywhere you look, there's something new to marvel at: a gleaming piece of glassware from Rome, an intricately woven Persian carpet, or a bundle of rare medicinal herbs from India. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Tang Dynasty's embrace of the Silk Road helped fuel China's golden age. Some believe that the wealth and knowledge brought in from trade allowed China to flourish in ways that other civilizations couldn't match. Others argue that the Tang's cultural achievements were the result of internal developments, such as their sophisticated bureaucracy and military prowess. Either way, the Tang Dynasty was undeniably a key player in the Silk Road network, and its success helped lay the groundwork for future Chinese prosperity. But it wasn't just about trade and wealth, it was also about the flow of ideas. The Tang Dynasty played a critical role in the spread of Buddhism from India into China. The Silk Road wasn't just a conduit for physical goods. It was also a highway for ideas, philosophies, and religions. Buddhist monks, along with traders, would travel along the Silk Road, bringing the teachings of Buddha to new lands. Many of the greatest Buddhist texts and scriptures were translated into Chinese during the Tang Dynasty, and Buddhism flourished in China, eventually becoming one of the country's dominant religions. Imagine being one of those Buddhist monks, walking along the Silk Road with your scrolls of teachings, moving from one city to another, bringing with you not just sacred texts, but a profound philosophy that would shape China's culture for centuries to come. Alongside them, traders would exchange knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, further enriching China's intellectual and cultural landscape. One of the most significant exchanges during this time was the transmission of printing technology from China to the West. The Tang Dynasty saw the invention of woodblock printing, which allowed for the mass production of books and other written materials. This technology would eventually make its way to the West, where it would play a key role in the spread of knowledge during the Renaissance. Historians still argue whether the Chinese were the first to invent printing, or whether it was the result of an exchange of ideas along the Silk Road. Regardless, the transmission of this technology was one of the most important cultural legacies of the Silk Road. While the Tang Dynasty's dominance on the Silk Road was undeniable, it wasn't without its challenges. The empire had to constantly defend its borders against nomadic invaders from the north, and tensions between the ruling Chinese and the foreign traders often flared up. But despite these challenges, the Tang Dynasty continued to thrive, and the Silk Road remained a vital link between East and West. Now, as we imagine ourselves in the bustling city of Chang'an, it's worth reflecting on what made this era so special. The Tang Dynasty was a time when China was at the height of its power and influence. The city of Chang'an was not just a political center, it was a cultural and economic beacon for the entire Silk Road. It was here that East met West, where goods, ideas, and religions flowed in and out, creating a unique blend of cultures that would have a lasting impact on the world. The Tang Dynasty's influence on the Silk Road didn't end with the empire itself. The cultural and intellectual exchanges that took place during this time helped to shape the world for centuries to come. The flow of goods and ideas along the Silk Road helped to create a more interconnected world, one where civilizations were no longer isolated, but instead were part of a larger global network. Historians still debate the legacy of the Silk Road during the Tang Dynasty. Some argue that it was the height of the Silk Road's success, while others suggest that it marked the beginning of its decline. Regardless of where one stands, it's clear that the Tang Dynasty played a pivotal role in shaping the course of history, both in China and beyond that, as we move forward along the Silk Road. Let's not forget the significant role that the Tang Dynasty played in making it one of the most important trade routes in history. It was during this time that the Silk Road became truly global, connecting not just East and West, but also facilitating the exchange of culture, knowledge, and ideas that would forever shape the world. Now, as we continue our journey down the Silk Road, we enter an area that, while often overshadowed by the larger empires, played a crucial role in the flow of goods and ideas Central Asia. This region, situated between China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean world, was like the beating heart of the Silk Road, where different cultures met, traded, and exchanged not just goods, but also philosophies, religions, and even technologies. Central Asia, with its vast steppes and rugged terrain, was inhabited by a range of nomadic tribes who knew the land better than anyone else. These nomads were not just warriors or herders, they were the lifeblood of the Silk Road. They guided caravans through harsh deserts, across treacherous mountain passes, and along river valleys that would otherwise be impassable for merchants unfamiliar with the terrain. They were the true masters of the road, and their ability to navigate these difficult landscapes made them indispensable to the success of the Silk Road. Imagine yourself as one of these nomads, riding your horse across the endless steppes of Central Asia. The horizon stretches before you, an unbroken line of dust and sky. You know this land like the back of your hand, every hidden oasis, every mountain pass, and every dangerous sandstorm. Your tribe's knowledge of the terrain allows you to safely guide a caravan of merchants from one end of the Silk Road to the other. The goods they carry, silk, spices, and rare artifacts, are valuable, but it is your expertise that ensures they reach their destination safely. Historians still debate whether the nomads of Central Asia were more than just guides and protectors of the trade routes. Were they also key players in the trade itself? It's true that many of these tribes engaged in trade, acting as intermediaries between the great empires of China, Persia, and Rome, but their role wasn't just limited to trading material goods. They were also cultural brokers, carrying stories, technologies, and religious beliefs from one end of the Silk Road to the other. Their role in the spread of Buddhism, for instance, was pivotal, as many Central Asian tribes helped transmit Buddhist teachings from India to China. But it wasn't just Buddhism that spread along the Silk Road. Central Asia also played a key role in the exchange of ideas between East and West. For example, it was in the oasis cities of Samarkand and Bukhara that Persian, Indian, and Chinese scholars gathered to exchange scientific knowledge, particularly in the fields of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. The nomads, who had access to a wide variety of knowledge from across the known world, were instrumental in carrying these ideas from one culture to another. Their role as intermediaries in the transmission of knowledge cannot be overstated. Let's now turn our attention to the fascinating cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, which were among the most important urban centers along the Silk Road. These cities were not just trade hubs. They were also intellectual and cultural capitals, attracting scholars, scientists, and artists from across the known world. The markets in Samarkand were filled with the finest silk, carpets, and spices, but the true treasures of the city lay in its libraries and universities. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Samarkand, surrounded by scholars and travelers from all corners of the earth. The air is thick with the scent of spices and incense, and the sounds of merchants haggling blend with the hum of philosophical debates. Historians still debate how much influence these cities had on the intellectual developments of the ancient world. Some argue that it was in these cities that the foundations of modern science and mathematics were laid. The great mathematician and astronomer Al-Khwarizmi, who lived in Baghdad and Samarkand in the 9th century, is often credited with introducing the concepts of algebra to the West. His work, which was based on the knowledge transmitted through the Silk Road, would go on to influence European scholars during the Renaissance. The spread of this knowledge was a testament to the far-reaching impact of the Silk Road on global intellectual history, in addition to the exchange of ideas. These cities were also places where different religious traditions coexisted and influenced one another. Samarkand, for example, was home to both Buddhists and Zoroastrians, as well as early Christian and Jewish communities. The diversity of religions in these cities contributed to an atmosphere of tolerance and intellectual exchange, where ideas could be debated, tested, and refined. The exchange of religious beliefs along the Silk Road from the spread of Buddhism to the introduction of Islam, was one of the most profound aspects of the route's cultural impact. Now, imagine yourself walking through the streets of Bukhara, the center of the Islamic world in Central Asia. The towering minarets and majestic mosques rise above the skyline, and the air is filled with the sound of prayer calls. Here, the exchange of ideas takes on a spiritual dimension as traders and travelers come together to share their beliefs and their understanding of the divine. Bukhara was a city of great intellectual ferment, where scholars would debate theology, philosophy, and the natural world. The city was a beacon of intellectual and spiritual light, drawing people from all across the Islamic world and beyond. It's important to note that the Silk Road wasn't just a one-way street of goods and ideas flowing from east to west. There was a constant exchange of knowledge, culture, and technology in both directions. While the West introduced the East to Greek philosophy, the East brought the West the ideas of Confucius, Buddhism, and Chinese innovations like paper and gunpowder. These exchanges were facilitated not just by the great empires, but by the smaller, less-known regions and tribes. Along the way, regions like Central Asia, where merchants, nomads, and scholars shared and shaped the world's knowledge for centuries. As we move forward along the Silk Road, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the significance of these smaller cultures. The nomads, traders, and scholars of Central Asia were not just bystanders to history, they were active participants in shaping the world we live in today. Their role in connecting civilizations, preserving knowledge, and spreading ideas across vast distances was crucial to the success of the Silk Road, and their legacy is still felt in the modern world. Historians still debate whether the true impact of Central Asia on the Silk Road has been fully appreciated. Some argue that the role of these lesser-known regions has often been overlooked in favor of the larger empires, but without Central Asia, the Silk Road would have never reached its full potential. These regions were the connective tissue that held the vast network of trade, culture, and knowledge together. And as we continue along the road, let's remember the vital role they played in making the Silk Road the extraordinary journey it was. As we continue our exploration along the Silk Road, let's now focus on one of the most exciting and unpredictable phases in the route's long history: the arrival of the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, radically reshaped the Silk Road and connected the East and West in a way no empire before had. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they unified vast stretches of land under a single banner, creating what was, in many ways, the first truly global empire in history. This era, often referred to as the Pax Mongolica, would allow the Silk Road to thrive like never before, as merchants, traders, and travelers could move across the empire with unprecedented ease and security. Picture this: you're traveling along the Silk Road during the height of Mongol power, somewhere between China and Europe. A once dangerous journey, fraught with the threat of bandits, unpredictable weather, and other hazards, is now far safer. Thanks to the Mongols, the roads are patrolled, and caravans can pass through the empire's vast territories without fear of attack. The Mongols, who were once known for their fierce warrior culture, had become the Silk Road's greatest protectors, ensuring that goods and people could move freely across the continent. Historians still debate whether the Mongols' impact on the Silk Road was purely positive. On the one hand, their conquests created an era of unprecedented stability, which allowed trade to flourish. On the other hand, the Mongols were a ruthless military force who conquered vast territories with terror and destruction. While their empire enabled the free flow of goods, it also left behind a trail of devastation, particularly in the cities they sacked along the way. The Mongols, however, were also known for their surprising openness to different cultures. Genghis Khan, for example, implemented a policy of religious tolerance, allowing people from various faiths to live and practice freely within his empire. The Mongols also helped facilitate the flow of knowledge along the Silk Road. Under their rule, the exchange of ideas, technologies, and scientific advancements reached new heights. For example, the Mongols helped bring Chinese innovations like gunpowder, papermaking, and printing to the West. These technologies would go on to play a key role in the development of the Renaissance in Europe. Additionally, the Mongols were instrumental in spreading knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. In many ways, their empire became a conduit for the exchange of intellectual ideas, as scholars from the East and West were encouraged to travel and share their knowledge. Now, let's take a moment to imagine the Mongol-controlled cities that sprang up along the Silk Road during this time, places like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Baghdad. These cities became vibrant hubs of culture, commerce, and scholarship. Samarkand, in particular, flourished under the rule of Timur, Tamerlane, a descendant of Genghis Khan, who made the city one of the most magnificent in the world. Here, traders, scholars, and artists from all over the Silk Road converged, exchanging goods and ideas. It was during this period that the Silk Road became a true crossroads of civilization, where East met West, and ideas flowed freely. But it wasn't all about goods and knowledge. The Mongol Empire also had a huge impact on the political landscape of the Silk Road. The Mongols unified the various empires, kingdoms, and tribes that had once been fragmented, creating a unified network of trade routes. The once disjointed territories along the Silk Road were now bound together under the Mongol banner. And for the first time in history, there was a single political entity controlling the vast majority of the trade routes. This allowed for greater coordination and efficiency, which boosted the volume of trade and helped to establish a true global economy. Historians still argue over whether the Mongols' unification of the Silk Road was a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, it allowed for greater trade and cultural exchange than ever before. On the other hand, the Mongols were known for their brutal military campaigns, and their conquests often led to the destruction of entire cities. For example, the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and the loss of an entire library of scientific and philosophical works. However, it's also true that the Mongols were instrumental in preserving many cultural and intellectual traditions, especially those of the Islamic world, which would later be carried on by scholars and traders along the Silk Road. Now, imagine standing in the center of a Mongol-controlled city during the height of their empire. The streets are filled with the sounds of merchants haggling, the clang of metal as blacksmiths work on their crafts, and the murmur of scholars engaged in deep discussion. You might see Persian, Chinese, and European merchants trading goods from across the world, while artisans and craftsmen produce intricate works of art and technology. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, created an environment where commerce and culture could flourish in ways that hadn't been seen before. One of the most lasting legacies of the Mongol Empire was their role in the creation of the first truly global network. It wasn't just that goods were exchanged across vast distances, it was that cultures and ideas were able to flow freely between the East and the West. This cultural exchange was a direct result of the Mongol Empire's political and military dominance, which provided the stability necessary for trade and intellectual exchange to thrive. The result was a more interconnected world, where different civilizations could learn from one another and share their knowledge, laying the groundwork for the modern world. Historians still debate whether the Mongols' impact on the Silk Road was ultimately positive or negative. While their conquests were undeniably brutal, Their role in connecting the world and facilitating trade and cultural exchange cannot be denied. Without the Mongols, the Silk Road would have never reached the heights it did during the 13th and 14th centuries. Their empire provided the stability, protection, and infrastructure necessary for the Silk Road to thrive, and for that, we owe them a great deal. As we move forward along the Silk Road, it's important to remember that the Mongol Empire's influence wasn't just about trade or conquest, it was about the lasting connections they helped forge between East and West. These connections would continue to shape the world long after the Mongols themselves had faded from power. As we move along the Silk Road toward the later stages of its history, we reach a point where the road begins to fragment. The Mongol Empire, which had once unified vast swaths of territory, began to splinter, leading to the decline of the Pax Mongolica and the disintegration of the once mighty trade routes. This period, marked by the fall of empires, the rise of new powers, and the advent of new technologies, saw the end of the Silk Road's dominance as the primary means of connecting East and West. But even in decline, the Silk Road continued to exert a profound influence on world history. The decline wasn't an immediate collapse, it was a gradual shift. As the Mongols fragmented into separate khanates, each region began to develop its own systems of trade and governance. The political unity that had once defined the Silk Road faded, but the commercial and cultural exchanges didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they evolved and adapted to the new political realities. One of the most important factors in this shift was the rise of maritime trade routes. As the land-based Silk Road began to slow, sea trade grew exponentially. The opening of sea routes across the Indian Ocean allowed for faster, cheaper, and more efficient trade between the East and West. The Portuguese and Spanish, during the Age of Exploration, began charting new paths across the seas, reaching Asia via the ocean, bypassing much of the old Silk Road routes entirely. This new maritime network would eventually outpace the Silk Road in terms of both speed and volume, marking the end of an era. Historians still debate how much the decline of the Silk Road was due to external factors like the rise of maritime trade, and how much was the result of internal challenges such as political instability and warfare. The fall of the Mongol Empire played a significant role, but it wasn't the only factor. The increasing fragmentation of the trade routes themselves, the rise of new powers, and the expansion of European colonialism all contributed to the eventual obsolescence of the Silk Road as the world's primary trade route. Imagine, then, the changes that occurred on the ground. The once thriving caravanserais and bustling market cities of the Silk Road began to lose their significance. The great cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, once rich with trade and culture, found themselves sidelined in favor of the growing maritime powers in the West. Trade routes that had once been vital to global commerce were now in decline, and those who had once made their living as merchants, traders, or travelers along the Silk Road had to adapt to the shifting tides of history. As we walk through these ancient cities in their final days as Silk Road hubs, imagine how different the world must have seemed. The streets, once teeming with traders from every corner of the globe, are now quieter. The sound of the camel's hooves on the cobblestones has faded, replaced by the occasional murmur of travelers on horseback. The markets, once overflowing with silk, spices, and glassware, are now more subdued, with fewer exotic goods to be found. The world was changing, and the Silk Road, for all its glory, was beginning to fade into history. Historians still debate what role the decline of the Silk Road played in the world's larger geopolitical shifts. Some argue that it marked the end of an era of intercultural exchange, while others suggest that it simply opened the door for a new phase of global interaction. In any case, the decline of the Silk Road didn't mean the end of trade or cultural exchange. It simply meant the beginning of a new chapter in history, but as we look back on the legacy of the Silk Road, we see that its influence didn't vanish with the decline of the caravan routes. The exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures that began on the Silk Road didn't stop, it simply took on new forms. As the world became more interconnected, new routes, both land and sea, began to take their place. The world was becoming more globalized, but it was no longer through the ancient highways of Central Asia. One of the most enduring legacies of the Silk Road is the way it transformed the way we think about the world. For centuries, the Silk Road connected cultures, empires, and peoples in ways that were unimaginable before. It helped lay the groundwork for a world that would become increasingly interconnected and interdependent. The very concept of globalization, with its emphasis on trade, communication, and cultural exchange, can trace its roots back to the Silk Road. Even as the physical route of the Silk Road faded, its impact on the modern world continued to shape the development of global trade, culture, and technology. The innovations that spread along the Silk Road, from paper and gunpowder to the wheel and compass, changed the course of history. And the cultural exchanges that took place along these ancient routes helped create a more interconnected world, laying the foundation for the world we live in today. Historians still debate whether the fall of the Silk Road truly marked the end of an era, or whether it was simply a shift into a new phase of global interaction. It's clear, however, that the legacy of the Silk Road endures. The connections made along those ancient trade routes still resonate today, and the goods we buy, the ideas we share, and the cultures that continue to influence one another. Imagine standing at the edge of a great caravanserai, looking out across the land that once connected the East and West. The world feels vast, yet small at the same time. The waves of history blow through the empty streets, and you realize that the echoes of the Silk Road's past will continue to shape the world for generations to come. As we leave behind the fading grandeur of the Silk Road's heyday, we must now turn our attention to the legacy that continues to reverberate through history, the cultural and technological exchanges that took place along this ancient route. Even as the physical routes faded from prominence, the intangible effects of the Silk Road continued to shape the world for centuries to come. The ideas, inventions, and philosophies that traveled these routes laid the groundwork for some of the most significant developments in human history. Let's start with one of the most lasting contributions of the Silk Road, the spread of writing and literature. The movement of people, goods, and ideas along the Silk Road allowed for the transmission of written texts and literary traditions between East and West. For example, Buddhist scriptures made their way from India to China, where they were translated and incorporated into Chinese culture. These texts not only influenced Chinese religious practices, but also became a foundational element of East Asian literature. The spread of religious and philosophical texts along the Silk Road helped shape the intellectual development of entire civilizations, influencing everything from science to politics. One of the most notable examples of this is the spread of the Indian numeral system, which was passed along the Silk Road to the Islamic world and then to Europe. The system of numbers we use today, including the concept of zero, was transmitted along these ancient trade routes, and its adoption had a profound impact on mathematics and science. Imagine, for a moment, the revolutionary effect of introducing a completely new way of counting to the Western world. The adoption of this numeral system opened the door to more advanced calculations and eventually led to the development of algebra and calculus, mathematics that would fuel the scientific revolutions of the Renaissance and beyond. Historians still debate the extent to which the transfer of knowledge along the Silk Road was deliberate or incidental. Was the spread of mathematical knowledge a direct result of interactions between scholars, or was it an unintended consequence of trade? Whatever the case, the impact was clear. The Silk Road became a bridge for ideas and innovations that changed the way the world thought about everything from mathematics to astronomy. Speaking of astronomy, let's take a moment to appreciate how the Silk Road facilitated the exchange of astronomical knowledge. Both the Chinese and the Islamic world were renowned for their advances in astronomy, and they shared their discoveries through trade and intellectual exchange. For example, Islamic astronomers, who had access to ancient Greek and Indian astronomical texts, translated and refined these works, incorporating new observations of the stars and planets. At the same time, Chinese astronomers were making their own breakthroughs, such as the invention of the seismoscope and the development of star catalogs. Through the Silk Road, these diverse astronomical traditions blended and influenced one another. The exchange of knowledge between astronomers in Central Asia, Persia, India, and China laid the groundwork for the development of more accurate star maps and observatories. By the time European explorers and scientists began their voyages of discovery in the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, they were building on the knowledge that had been passed along the Silk Road. Now, let's zoom in on the exchange of technologies along the Silk Road. While the most famous goods transported were luxuries like silk and spices, many of the technologies that traveled along the route had an even more significant impact on human history. One of the most important of these was papermaking, a technology that originated in China and eventually spread to the Islamic world and then to Europe. The introduction of paper revolutionized the way people recorded information. It made books and written knowledge more accessible, paving the way for the spread of literacy, education, and scientific advancement. Historians still argue whether the transmission of papermaking technology along the Silk Road was as important as it is often made out to be. Some believe that the widespread use of paper in the Islamic world and Europe was an inevitable consequence of technological innovation, while others argue that its spread was a key factor in the development of modern education systems. Regardless, it's clear that papermaking played a crucial role in the spread of knowledge and culture, allowing ideas to be shared across vast distances in ways that had previously been impossible. One of the other key technologies that traveled along the Silk Road was gunpowder. Invented in China during the Tang Dynasty, gunpowder made its way along the trade routes to the Middle East and Europe, where it had a profound effect on warfare. Imagine for a moment the seismic shift in military tactics that occurred as the knowledge of gunpowder spread across the globe. The development of firearms, cannons, and explosives changed the nature of conflict, and the Silk Road played a key role in making these innovations a global phenomenon. Historians still debate whether gunpowder was the single most important military innovation to spread along the Silk Road. While it certainly had a major impact on warfare, other factors, such as the development of mounted cavalry and the spread of ironworking techniques, also played important roles in the evolution of military strategy. Nevertheless, the role of gunpowder in shaping the course of world history cannot be overstated, and the Silk Road was the conduit through which this transformative technology was transmitted. Now that we've looked at some of the key technologies and ideas that traveled along the Silk Road, let's take a moment to consider the broader cultural impact. The Silk Road was not just a conduit for material goods, it was also a highway for cultural exchange. The exchange of art, music, and literature along the Silk Road had a lasting impact on the development of civilizations. As goods moved along the route, so did cultural traditions. Chinese, Persian, Indian, and Greco-Roman artistic styles blended and influenced one another, creating unique and hybrid forms of art that would shape the visual culture of the Silk Road. Think about the art of textiles, for example. The rich and intricate silk patterns produced in China influenced textile production across Central Asia and the Islamic world. Similarly, the use of vibrant colors and intricate designs in Islamic pottery and Persian carpets left their mark on the artwork of China and India. This cultural blending didn't just happen in the visual arts, it also affected literature, music, and even food. Recipes, instruments, and literary traditions passed along the Silk Road helped create a rich cultural tapestry that continues to shape global culture to this day. Historians still debate the extent to which cultural exchange along the Silk Road was driven by trade or by the movements of individuals such as artists, scholars, and religious leaders. Some believe that the exchange of culture was primarily a byproduct of trade, while others argue that it was the result of a more deliberate effort to share and disseminate artistic and intellectual traditions. Either way, the impact of the Silk Road on world culture is undeniable. As we continue our journey through the remaining chapters of the Silk Road, we must now turn our attention to a key yet often overlooked aspect: the end of the road, the slow and gradual decline that marked the transition from the era of ancient and medieval trade to the modern world. While the decline of the Silk Road was not a single event, the gradual waning of the route's dominance was driven by several intertwined factors that changed the course of history. Let's start with one of the most critical factors: the rise of European sea routes. By the 15th century, Portuguese and Spanish explorers had begun to chart new paths across the oceans, seeking to bypass the traditional land routes. The famous voyages of Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, which eventually led to the discovery of sea routes to Asia, rendered the overland Silk Road less relevant. The new maritime routes allowed for faster, more efficient travel of goods, and as a result, the overland Silk Road began to lose its status as the principal trade network between East and West. Imagine yourself as a merchant in the early 16th century, once accustomed to the great overland caravans and now witnessing a new age of exploration. The seas, which were once viewed as dangerous and unpredictable, are now the new highways of commerce. Ships laden with goods from India, Africa, and the Americas are making their way across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Suddenly, the desert caravans seem slow and inefficient by comparison. With the rise of sea trade, the importance of Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara began to decline. Once vibrant centers of culture and commerce, they slowly faded into the background as Europe's maritime powers took center stage. While the development of maritime trade was one major factor, another crucial element in the decline of the Silk Road was the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans controlled large swaths of territory in the Middle East and had the ability to control trade routes that once linked Europe to Asia. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottomans began to assert control over key sections of the Silk Road, particularly those passing through Anatolia and the Levant. The Ottomans imposed new tariffs and taxes on goods passing through their empire, which made land trade increasingly expensive and less profitable. Traders were now forced to find alternative routes, and the ease of maritime shipping made the old Silk Road routes seem less appealing. Historians still debate the role that the Ottoman Empire played in the decline of the Silk Road. Some argue that the Ottomans merely acted as middlemen in the flow of goods, while others suggest that the empire's control over critical trade routes directly led to the diminishing importance of the land routes. Whatever the case, the Ottomans' rise to power certainly had a significant impact on the trade landscape, making it more difficult for merchants to rely solely on the ancient overland Silk Road. In addition to the rise of maritime trade and the Ottoman Empire, the Mongol invasions in the 13th and 14th centuries had also left lasting scars on the Silk Road. Though the Mongol Empire initially unified vast stretches of territory and facilitated the flow of goods. The empire's fragmentation into various khanates in the late 14th century had the opposite effect. The once stable routes that the Mongols had controlled began to fracture, with political instability and civil wars affecting trade. Now, think of the merchants who had once relied on the stability of the Mongol Empire for safe passage across Central Asia. With the collapse of Mongol unity, it became increasingly difficult to navigate the different regions controlled by various factions. Trade routes became less secure, and the once promising paths across the steppes and deserts became more hazardous. For the merchants who had braved the journey, the new political landscape became a deterrent. Historians still debate whether the Mongols' fragmentation was the true end of the Silk Road's dominance or merely one of several factors. Some suggest that the decline of the Mongol Empire caused a temporary lull in trade, while others argue that the Silk Road was already on the decline by the time the Mongol Empire collapsed. Regardless of the exact timeline, it's clear that the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire and the rise of new political entities significantly weakened the Silk Road. But even as the physical Silk Road began to fade, its cultural and intellectual legacy lived on. The ideas, innovations, and exchanges that occurred along the Silk Road continued to shape the world long after the caravanserais fell silent. The legacy of the Silk Road was not just in the material goods that were traded, but in the intellectual and cultural exchanges that occurred as merchants, scholars, and travelers made their way along these ancient routes. One of the most enduring aspects of the Silk Road's legacy is the transmission of knowledge. The Silk Road facilitated the movement of not just physical goods, but also ideas, from religion and philosophy to scientific and technological advancements. Think about the way Buddhism spread from India to China, Japan, and Korea. The teachings of Confucius and the principles of Islam were also carried across the Silk Road, blending and merging with local traditions in each new culture they encountered. In a sense, the Silk Road became a conveyor belt for humanity's most cherished ideas, a place where different cultures could meet and exchange their thoughts on life, society, and the universe. Historians still argue over the long-term effects of the Silk Road's intellectual exchanges. Some scholars believe that the intellectual networks established along the Silk Road had a profound influence on the Renaissance in Europe, while others argue that the cultural and technological exchange was more beneficial in the East, where it contributed to the rise of great empires like the Yuan and Ming dynasties. Regardless of the specifics, one thing is clear: the Silk Road's cultural and intellectual impact cannot be overstated. And so, as the physical Silk Road began to lose its central role in global trade, the ideas and connections it nurtured continued to shape the world. In many ways, the Silk Road was less a road in the traditional sense, and more of a symbol, an enduring symbol of human curiosity, ingenuity, and the desire to connect. The road may have been left behind, but the legacy it created continues to resonate in the world's cultures, technologies, and philosophies to this very day. As we move towards the final chapters of the Silk Road's grand history, it's time to reflect on the lasting effects this ancient network had on global culture, trade, and the interconnection of civilizations. While the physical roots may have faded into the annals of history, the legacy of the Silk Road endures in profound ways, shaping everything from global commerce to cultural exchange. Long after the caravans stopped rolling, one of the most significant, enduring impacts of the Silk Road is the way it shaped the modern concept of globalization. The idea of a connected world where goods, people, and ideas travel freely across borders can trace its roots directly to the Silk Road. It's no coincidence that as we enter the age of digital connectivity, we often find ourselves referring to the idea of a global marketplace. The Silk Road was, in many ways, the first truly global network. Though it was a physical trade route, the principles behind it, the exchange of goods and ideas between diverse peoples, the intermingling of cultures set the stage for the interconnected world we live in today. The idea of the Silk Road as a precursor to modern globalization is one that historians have explored in recent years. Some even argue that it was the trade of ideas, much more than goods, that truly left its mark on the world. The Silk Road allowed cultures as far apart as China and Rome, India and Persia to communicate and exchange knowledge. Art, religion, and technology spread through these regions, creating a complex web of interconnected civilizations that shared more than just trade commodities. This exchange of ideas led to the advancement of civilizations in ways that would have been impossible without such a network. Let's take a closer look at some of the ways the Silk Road contributed to the development of the modern world. One of the most lasting impacts of the trade routes was in the fields of medicine and science. Many of the key advancements in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics were made possible by the exchange of knowledge along the Silk Road. For example, it was through this network that the ancient Greek and Indian medical traditions reached China. Chinese medical practices were also exchanged with the Islamic world, where they influenced the development of early Western medical practices during the Renaissance. The Silk Road also played a key role in the dissemination of scientific knowledge, especially in astronomy and mathematics. The mathematical concepts that originated in India, such as the concept of zero and the decimal system, traveled along the Silk Road and were later adopted by the Islamic world and eventually by the West. The spread of astronomical knowledge from the east to the west through the Silk Road laid the foundation for later advancements in European astronomy. Imagine the profound impact of learning about the stars and planets in a way that was more systematic, scientific, and precise than ever before. This shared knowledge, which once traveled in the form of hand-copied manuscripts, transformed both the scientific and cultural landscapes of the ancient world. Perhaps one of the most profound contributions of the Silk Road was in the field of religion. Along the route, religious beliefs spread, adapted, and merged, creating new forms of spirituality that would influence entire civilizations. The most notable example is Buddhism, which traveled from India to China, Korea, Japan, and beyond. But it wasn't just Buddhism that traveled the Silk Road. Islam, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism all spread along these ancient routes, influencing the spiritual and cultural fabric of many societies. Historians often point to the spread of Buddhism as one of the most significant effects of the Silk Road. The religion traveled not just as an ideology, but as a cultural phenomenon, influencing art, philosophy, and society in ways that shaped civilizations from China to Central Asia, as Buddhist monks and traders made their way along the Silk Road. They carried sacred texts, relics, and iconography that would later inspire entire artistic traditions, like the famous Buddhist cave paintings at Dunhuang. These cultural exchanges played a key role in shaping the religious and philosophical landscape of Asia and even Europe. But let's also remember that the Silk Road was more than just a conduit for religion. It was a crossroads where different cultures encountered one another and sometimes clashed. The blending of Eastern and Western cultures led to both harmonious exchanges and tensions. The Byzantine Empire, for example, interacted with Persia and the Islamic caliphates, leading to both the sharing of knowledge and the occasional outbreak of conflict. Even in this tension, the Silk Road created spaces where diplomatic negotiations, cultural exchange, and the sharing of art and ideas could take place, helping to bridge the gap between conflicting cultures. Think about the journey of an ancient traveler, whether they were a merchant, a scholar, or a pilgrim. Their journey wasn't just about crossing physical distances, it was about crossing cultural boundaries. Every stop along the Silk Road was a chance to meet new people, exchange stories, learn new ways of life, and discover new ways of thinking. And though the Silk Road as a physical entity may have declined, the flow of ideas it initiated never truly stopped. One of the most enduring effects of the Silk Road was its impact on the development of trade networks in later centuries. As the overland routes became less relevant, new trade routes began to take shape, both overland and across the seas. The European age of exploration, which began in the late 15th century, was driven by the desire to find new trade routes to the east. Portuguese and Spanish explorers, seeking to bypass the overland Silk Road, sought sea routes to Asia and the Spice Islands. These new trade routes, coupled with the rise of European colonial empires, would eventually replace the Silk Road, but the spirit of trade and cultural exchange established by the ancient routes lived on in these new endeavors. Legacy of the Silk Road also extended to the establishment of a global economy. As European powers expanded their colonial empires, they continued to build on the economic exchanges that had been set in motion by the ancient trade routes. The Silk Road, in its decline, laid the foundations for modern trade systems that connected the world in ways that the ancient merchants could only have dreamed of. The modern era of globalization, of interconnected economies and cultures, is, in many ways, the child of the Silk Road's long and winding legacy. Historians still argue whether the world would have become as interconnected without the Silk Road. Could modern globalization have happened without the exchange of goods, knowledge, and culture that occurred along these ancient trade routes? Perhaps, but it's hard to imagine the rise of modern civilization without the immense contributions of the Silk Road. From the way we exchange goods and ideas to the way we connect as a global society, the foundations were laid long ago by traders, scholars, and travelers who traversed the vast stretches of the Silk Road. As we approach the final chapters of the Silk Road saga, it's crucial to reflect on the end of the great trading network, not just in terms of physical routes, but in the cultural shifts that marked its decline. The decline of the Silk Road was not a sudden collapse, nor was it marked by a single catastrophic event. Rather, it was a gradual fading, brought about by the shifting tides of empire, technological advancements, and the changing dynamics of global trade. As we look at this decline, we see how the legacy of the Silk Road was ultimately absorbed into the broader fabric of the world's history, influencing everything from geopolitics to global trade systems. While the fall of the Silk Road came with the decline of the Mongol Empire and the rise of maritime trade routes, we must also acknowledge the growing role of regional powers, which further fragmented the once unified network of trade. The rise of new empires and competing trade routes in the 15th and 16th centuries slowly undermined the Silk Road's prominence. Europe's age of exploration, driven by the thirst for spices and new markets, drew more and more attention away from overland trade as ships set sail around the world. Imagine for a moment standing at the shores of the Mediterranean as the first European explorers set off on their fabled voyages. While the overland caravans were still moving across the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, the global stage was beginning to shift. The majestic trade cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Baghdad, once at the forefront of international commerce, now face competition from the burgeoning maritime empires of Spain and Portugal, who sought direct routes to India and the Spice Islands. The ancient trade routes, once vital arteries for global exchange, were becoming less relevant as new routes across the sea provided faster and more reliable ways to move goods. Historians often debate whether the decline of the Silk Road was inevitable, or if new powers like the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals contributed to the change. The rise of these regional empires brought their own trade networks to prominence, and though they continued to rely on parts of the old Silk Road, they also began to develop new systems that were better suited to their needs and geography. Ottomans, in particular, controlled key choke points between East and West, yet they didn't offer the same level of open access to trade that the Mongol Empire had. This gradual shift toward a more fragmented world of trade made it harder for the Silk Road to maintain its global significance. Yet, while the Silk Road itself began to lose its role as the primary avenue for trade, its influence persisted in more subtle ways. The intellectual exchanges, the art, the technologies, and the philosophies that traveled along the road did not disappear. In fact, they continued to shape the future of the world for centuries after the routes themselves began to fade. The spread of paper, printing, gunpowder, and even architectural ideas from the east to the west remained part of the global exchange. Even as the trade routes themselves were replaced by maritime networks, even though the overland routes had lost their earlier prominence, the remnants of the Silk Road continued to influence geopolitics, culture, and trade. The legacy of the Silk Road didn't end when the caravans stopped crossing the deserts. Rather, it evolved and adapted to the changing world. The ideas and goods that had moved along the Silk Road remained embedded in the cultures that had interacted with it. The rise of modern empires, such as the British and Russian empires, continued to interact with the echoes of the Silk Road, as both sought to control territories that had once been part of the great network of trade and culture. In the centuries following the decline of the Silk Road, as the world shifted toward new forms of communication, transportation, and trade, the memory of the route remained. Even today, we can trace the influence of the Silk Road in various aspects of our modern world. From the spread of Buddhism to China, the introduction of Chinese silk to Europe, the transfer of ancient knowledge in astronomy and mathematics to the foundations of global trade, the Silk Road's enduring impact is still present. One interesting facet of the Silk Road's legacy is the way it was romanticized in later centuries. Explorers, historians, and artists looking back on the great network of trade routes created a mythology around the Silk Road, painting it as a symbol of exotic adventure, cultural exchange, and the spread of wealth and knowledge. This romantic vision of the Silk Road as a vibrant, colorful, and magical place has persisted in the popular imagination, inspiring countless works of literature, art, and film. While the reality of the Silk Road was more complex and often brutal, the myths surrounding it continue to captivate our collective imagination. Historians still debate the exact significance of the Silk Road in the global context. Some view it as a symbol of the early stages of globalization, while others see it as a more localized network of regional exchanges. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is certain: the Silk Road played a fundamental role in connecting the East and West, fostering cultural, religious, and economic exchanges that would leave lasting marks on both regions. Even in its decline, the Silk Road set the stage for the modern world, laying the foundations for the globalized society we know today. As we close this chapter of history, it's important to remember that the Silk Road was more than just a trade route. It was a bridge between cultures, a meeting point for civilizations, and a pathway for the exchange of ideas, goods, and beliefs. And while the physical road may have been abandoned, the legacy of the Silk Road lives on in the products we buy, the cultures we encounter, and the technologies we rely on every day. The decline of the Silk Road wasn't the end of its influence. It was simply the beginning of a new phase in global history. The story of the Silk Road is far from over. It continues to live on in the connections we make, the global marketplace we participate in, and the ideas that continue to flow across the world. The legacy of the Silk Road is woven into the fabric of modern civilization, reminding us that even in decline, a great network of trade and cultural exchange can leave a lasting imprint on the world. As we reach the final stretch of our journey along the Silk Road, it's time to reflect on the ultimate legacy of this ancient network. Although the overland trade routes faded with the rise of maritime trade and the shifting tides of empire, the Silk Road's influence continues to echo through the corridors of time. The exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures that began on those dusty paths laid the groundwork for much of the world we know today. The Silk Road didn't just connect China to Europe. It created a world that was, in its own way, more interconnected than ever before. The transmission of knowledge, goods, and technologies across the vast distances of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe shaped the course of history in ways that we continue to feel today. While the routes themselves may have disappeared, the impact of this ancient exchange continues to reverberate across the globe. From our modern trade systems to our cultural traditions, let's begin with the enduring legacy of trade. Though the Silk Road itself is no longer a vital pathway for merchants and traders, the basic principles of trade and exchange that emerged along these ancient routes still govern the global economy. The Silk Road was, in essence, the birthplace of long-distance, cross-cultural trade. It connected diverse civilizations, allowed for the free flow of goods and ideas, and created a framework for international commerce that would persist long after the decline of the overland routes. Today, the world's economy is more interconnected than ever before. The internet, air travel, and modern shipping have replaced the caravans and camels of the ancient Silk Road, but the global marketplace remains at the heart of our interconnected world. Trade has become faster, more efficient, and more complex. But the foundation for this global exchange was built by the merchants, travelers, and diplomats who traversed the Silk Road, laying the groundwork for what we now recognize as global commerce. The spirit of the Silk Road lives on in our modern supply chains, our international markets, and the global flow of goods and services. In addition to the economic impact, the cultural exchange that took place along the Silk Road continues to shape the world today. The Silk Road was not just a route for goods, it was a meeting point for cultures, religions, and philosophies. The exchange of ideas between East and West was one of the most profound aspects of this ancient network. From the spread of Buddhism to China to the transmission of Greco-Roman knowledge to the Islamic world, the Silk Road facilitated the transfer of intellectual and cultural capital that would have a lasting influence on the development of civilizations. Consider, for example, how the ideas that traveled along the Silk Road influenced the Renaissance in Europe. The transmission of classical Greek and Roman texts, preserved by Islamic scholars, played a crucial role in the intellectual awakening that took place in Europe. The printing press, another key technological advancement that traveled along these ancient routes, allowed for the rapid dissemination of ideas that helped fuel the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Enlightenment. Similarly, the exchange of technologies that took place along the Silk Road laid the foundation for many of the scientific and technological advancements that would come centuries later. The Chinese invention of papermaking, for example, was passed along the Silk Road to the Islamic world, where it was refined and then transmitted to Europe. The same can be said for gunpowder, the compass, and other technological innovations that were first developed in China and later spread to the West, influencing everything from military tactics to navigation. The Silk Road's role in shaping the modern world is not limited to trade, ideas, and technology. It also had a profound impact on art and culture. The mixing of cultures along the Silk Road produced a rich and diverse artistic heritage that can still be seen in the art and architecture of the regions it passed through. the influence of Chinese, Persian, Indian, and Greco-Roman artistic. Traditions can be seen in everything from sculpture to textiles, from pottery to painting. The Silk Road was a true melting pot of artistic expression, and its influence on the visual culture of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe continues to be felt today. One of the most enduring symbols of the Silk Road's cultural legacy is the art of textiles. The intricate patterns and vibrant colors of Persian carpets, Chinese silk fabrics, and Indian textiles all owe their existence to the long history of trade and cultural exchange that took place along the Silk Road. These textiles, once traded across continents, now serve as a testament to the creative spirit of the ancient world and the connections made possible by the Silk Road. But perhaps one of the most enduring and meaningful legacies of the Silk Road is the way it brought different civilizations together. The Silk Road was not just a network for the exchange of goods, it was a network for the exchange of human experience. The stories, traditions, and beliefs that traveled along the Silk Road are the stories of humanity itself. The experiences of the merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and scholars who journeyed along these ancient routes form the very fabric of global history. The Silk Road helped foster a world where cultures were not isolated, but were instead in constant conversation with one another. The trade routes connected people of different languages, religions, and customs, creating a world where diversity was celebrated rather than feared. In a way, the Silk Road was a microcosm of the modern world, a world where people from different backgrounds could exchange ideas, learn from one another, and build connections across vast distances. And as we look at the modern world today, we can see the continuing importance of global connections. The Silk Road may be a relic of the past, but the spirit of international exchange that it embodied is alive and well in the world today. Whether it's through global trade, cultural diplomacy, or scientific collaboration, the legacy of the Silk Road continues to shape the way we interact with one another across borders. Even as the world becomes more interconnected through modern technologies, it's worth remembering that this process of global interconnectedness began long ago with the humble Silk Road. It was through the Silk Road that the first seeds of globalization were planted, and its influence still reaches us today. As we wrap up our journey along the Silk Road, we can reflect on just how much this ancient trade network has shaped the world we live in today. The Silk Road wasn't just a series of routes connecting different empires. It was a conduit for the exchange of culture, knowledge, and commerce that continues to influence our lives. The legacy of the Silk Road reminds us that the connections we make, the ideas we share, and the cultures we engage with are all part of a much longer history of human exchange. The Silk Road may have faded from the maps, but its influence remains, woven into the fabric of modern civilization, reminding us that the world has always been and will always be connected.